What do you hold most dear in life? What are these ethical and moral principles which anchor those values? What does a life look like which consistently honors those values, even on the very most difficult issues of our day? If you're interested in those questions, then I have to tell you, you're in luck. That's the focus of this course. In particular, we'll be focusing on those principles and values which serve as the basis of a pro-life ethic. Here in Unit 1, we'll be thinking about nonviolence, protection of and support for the most vulnerable, speaking up on behalf of the least among us, especially when they have no voice or power, and other ideas which have animated the pro-life movements over time. In the past, the overarching adversary for the pro-life movement has been labeled, you've probably heard it, the culture of death. And while that does have some important explanatory power, I believe Pope Francis's image of throwaway culture gives us additional insight, essential additional insight. In this course, we will think hard about what it means to consistently live a life in community with others which resists throwaway culture. One thing which keeps us from doing this consistently, at least in my experience, is an undue and at times even idolatrous loyalty to secular politics, left, right, liberal, conservative, red, blue. If you identify as a conservative, you are likely to find many points of view you disagree with in this course, particularly when we discuss war, the death penalty, and immigration. If you identify as a liberal, same thing, especially when we discuss reproductive technologies, abortion, and euthanasia. But as you discovered in the pre-reading for the course, it might be helpful to think of your time with us engaging these ideas by putting aside a moment secular political commitments and instead focusing on the most fundamental things that animate us. And for Christians, of course, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ. I have multiple goals for the course, but one of the most important is to show that when we disengage from the frothy and anxious debate over secular politics, when we dive down into our deepest values, and when we apply them consistently, we will be presented with new and hopeful opportunities for dialogue in our polarized culture. Dialogue which will, yes, uncover common ground, but even more importantly, dialogue which will make our arguments more interesting, substantive, and fruitful. You will see that in this unit, Cardinal Bernardine and Pope Francis serve as kind of bookends for what is often called the consistent life ethic, or CLE. Let us be blunt, however. Some criticize Cardinal Bernardine and Francis as liberal Catholics who advocate a CLE in an attempt to diminish or dilute a pro-life view by, say, ignoring or minimizing the importance of abortion, or by collapsing all the issues together into one without distinctions. And to be fair, there are indeed some thinkers and activists who do this. But it's not what Bernardine did, nor is it what Francis is doing. And you'll see in this unit, and in the book text more generally, both of these thinkers don't see abortion as one issue among many, nor do they collapse all issues into one. Indeed, you may be surprised to learn just how strongly Francis in particular condemns abortion, at one point calling it, quote, a white-glove Nazi crime, end quote. This criticism of the CLE was never fair, especially because Pope St. John Paul II, in his magisterial work Evangelium Vitae, argued for a CLE, which included, among other issues, the death penalty and poverty. No one can criticize someone like JP2 for minimizing the importance of abortion, of course. On the contrary, it is consistently applying our most dearly held principles across a range of issues that makes the pro-life witness not only coherent and honest, but better able to avoid the blind spots of secular ideology and politics. Indeed, some of our greatest injustices in history have happened when we've failed to live out our principles and live them out consistently. Furthermore, it's at least my experience that something like the CLE is more effective in changing hearts and minds when it comes to the pro-life movement. Many with a different politics, for instance, dismiss the movement as, quote, conservative or somehow inherently wedded to conservative politics, and thus cannot really engage it seriously. But this story about the pro-life movement is also not true, and was never true. Today, over 20 million Democrats, for instance, identify as pro-life, and the movement itself in the US grew in part out of the anti-Vietnam War movement. It's interesting to note that the pro-life movement before Roe versus Wade had rallies that were very similar to rallies that were anti-war rallies. They even had practices where they burned their birth certificates, much like they burned their draft cards. And it was the same general kind of complaint that these cards or certificates were tools of government oppression. And in the context of abortion, the oppression was saying when human life began and saying, well, before this point, you don't matter. After this point, you do. This unit's reading concludes by laying out 7 pro-life principles that will be applied consistently across a range of issues. The principles themselves are at the heart of the gospel of Christ and the tradition of the church, with no concern at all for secular U.S. politics. Indeed, throughout the course, we will focus only on how these principles should motivate us to resist throwaway culture, not least because it tends to push back into the polarization, even idolatry, mentioned earlier. Most of this course will avoid engaging in secular politics and policymaking, fair warning. But what is throwaway culture? Basically, it is a culture in which everything has a price. Everything is a product or thing that can be used or consumed and then discarded. This is true even for people, though their thingification is often hidden by the language we use. The prenatal human child is a fetus or the products of conception, while the migrant seeking asylum is called names like illegal or even worse. This radical reduction of the inherent dignity of the person makes it easier to discard people and figuratively, or even sometimes literally, throw them away. Pope Francis helpfully asks us to counter throwaway culture with a culture of encounter and hospitality, especially for the least among us, to avoid what he calls the globalization of indifference and political idolatry, by telling us to get up off the couch ourselves and encounter and welcome those on the margins, wherever we find them, on any set of issues. Unit 2's reading on reproductive technology explores a particular example of how consumer culture turns human beings into things to be used and discarded. During that reading, pay very close attention to how the language and assumptions of our culture hide the process by which people are turned into things to be used and discarded. And above all, try to engage on the topic by focusing on your most fundamental moral values, not via a U.S. secular political lens. The result, to borrow a phrase, may surprise you.